My name is Sarah Henry, the host of The Activist Lawyer, offering a platform for lawyers to share their story and journey into law and activism. Guests will discuss the challenges and highlights of their work, as well as important cases, opinions on legal and political matters, and will offer advice and tips for anyone interested in pursuing a career in human rights law, public interest law, or criminal justice, among others. So tune in and engage with us, and please share and review where possible so we can keep bringing you insightful episodes featuring fantastic guests. Today on the podcast, I am joined by Joshua Colangelo-Bryan, who is Special Counsel at Human Rights First. Joshua spearheads impact litigation and advocacy efforts to uphold democratic principles and support defenders of human rights. Beyond representing Guantanamo detainees, he has sued Turkey for assaulting protesters in Washington, D.C., Trump administration for attempting to deport a college student based on protest activity, which we discussed today, and has also conducted human rights investigations in countries such as Yemen, Syria and Bahrain. He also served with the United Nations mission in Kosovo. So it was a really lovely opportunity to speak with Joshua, who you'll see has such a great story to tell and is truly an authentic, committed and passionate lawyer, and indeed published author with his new book, Through the Gates of Hell, American Injustice at Guantanamo Bay. Now, the book is based on a true story featuring Joshua himself, an American attorney, and his client Jabbar Mohammed, who was detained in Guantanamo Bay under excruciating circumstances. So a friendship formed between the two. The two remain in contact. We talk a little bit about that. Mohammed was obviously freed, and we're delighted that this book will feature on the Activist Lawyer Book Club next year. So I wanted to really ask Brian about his clients and, his relationship with the clients who were really detained, often without charge, under the most unimaginable, cruel and inhumane circumstances. And I also wanted to discuss his opinion on the state of international law today, given his expertise in the area. We also talk about his journey into law, and he has some really solid advice and tips for anybody who was interested in getting into this type of work. So I hope you enjoy today's episode as much as I did recording it, and please remember to like, share and review. So I am very delighted to be joined by Joshua Colangelo-Bryan. Joshua, thank you for joining me on the Activist Lawyer podcast.
Oh, thank you. I'm very glad that you think I qualify to appear on a podcast with that name.
You absolutely do. And I can't wait to get into some of your work and, of course, talk about your new book that has recently been published. But I'm wondering, could we go back in time just a little bit to talk about your background into law and your journey into law? What or who inspired you to become a lawyer?
Well, it was more years ago than I care to admit, but I was working in my mid-20s with an employment consulting firm doing things like workplace harassment prevention training. And sometimes we would do that with, fairly rough crowds of police officers or longshoremen, groups that would push back sometimes. What I noticed, though, was when I did those trainings with lawyers, who we sometimes brought on for that purpose, people tended to get quieter and tended to listen. There just was a certain authority that the lawyers had when they were describing the consequences, the legal consequences of bad behavior that got people's attention. And so that was pretty appealing. And my thought at the time was maybe I should go to law school and become an employment lawyer, because these are important issues. That was my plan until I was just about ready to graduate, which was almost at the same time that the NATO bombing campaign in Kosovo, this was 1999, was coming to an end. And for whatever reason, one day I had the thought, I should go and try to help. This is an area that was decimated by the Serb and Yugoslav militaries and paramilitaries. They need help. I'd never done that kind of thing before. I don't even know why I thought of it. But I ended up going for a number of months right after NATO entered the province and working on an emergency shelter project. It was by far the most compelling thing I'd ever done. It made domestic employment law feel a bit ho-hum by comparison, and it really sparked my interest in international law, and in particular, human rights law and humanitarian law. So, it was not a straight line, but sort of organically, phase by phase, that's how I ended up becoming interested in these issues.
Brilliant. And you're now working with Human Rights First as of earlier this year. And we're very lucky because we had Brian Dooley, your colleague, on not so long ago. And that was a fantastic episode where he spoke about human rights defenders and, of course, the work of Human Rights First. But you might take us through your role there as Special Counsel, leading the litigation and advocacy efforts to protect and advance international human rights. Maybe can you share with us how you arrived at this position and what's your kind of day-to-day work looking like?
Sure. So I actually had an arrangement for many years at a private firm where I was allowed to do about half of my time pro bono, meaning giving away services for good causes. As the calendar moved towards the end of 2024 and elections in the U.S., I began to look for a place to be fully engaged doing work that I believe in. And so I came to Human Rights First because it was going to allow me to do litigation, but also non-litigation human rights investigations and advocacy, which is something that I've done over the years. It was that combination, which you don't find at that many NGOs, that brought me there. I arrived about 2 weeks before the inauguration of the Trump administration. And as you can imagine, a lot of our litigation efforts have arisen from various things the administration has done. So, for example, we represent a student at Columbia University in New York. She came to this country when she was 7 with her parents from South Korea. She's a green card holder. She has a GPA higher than I even thought it was possible to have a GPA. But she made the fatal mistake of going to a protest concerning Gaza. As a result, her name got onto the government's short list of non-citizens that it wants to deport for attending such protests. 2 squads of government agents were dispatched to find her, both at her dorm room in New York and at her parents' home in Virginia. Thankfully, she wasn't at either place, and so we were able to go into court and get a judge to issue an order barring the government from arresting or deporting her while we litigate the question of whether the First Amendment lets the government punish green card holders just because of their political views, which obviously we think is a question that should be answered with a resounding no. We also have done litigation relating to the administration's sanctions on various international criminal court personnel. We've done a lot of litigation on behalf of nonprofits in the U.S. that are getting targeted because they're involved in issues in a way that the administration disfavors. So there's quite a bit of work protecting what are fundamental rights and rights that we really haven't seen attacked in this way, since the time of McCarthyism. Yeah. If your viewers recall the fine senator from Wisconsin many years ago.
That's right. My goodness, it's human rights is really having a time in a moment right now in America. And I mean, we've spoken before in the podcast about ICE and as well, not only the work that immigration lawyers are having to do at the moment, but also the attacks and the marginalization of those lawyers themselves. So yeah, really challenging circumstances. But yeah, lots of work coming your way. And that's so interesting about the student and the arrest. It's something, of course, we started having to deal with here as well at some point. So great work going on, but you also have had time to publish a fantastic new book, which is receiving strong reviews from both lawyers and critics around the world. Through the Gates of Hell, American Injustice at Guantanamo Bay. Fantastic. But what inspired you, Joshua, to write the book? And, what do you hope to achieve with this book?
At the core, It's really a very human story about a deep friendship that forms between an American lawyer and his Saudi Bahraini client who's locked up at Guantanamo, and a deep friendship that forms in, of all places, Guantanamo. And I apologize for speaking about myself in the third person. I am the American
You're
lawyer.
the lawyer.
And my friend and former client Jabber is the man who was locked up there. So when we started talking about this last year, we thought that it would have some relevance because we really are living in an age of what feels like hyper demagoguery, whether it's Vladimir Putin saying that all Ukrainians are Nazis and so he has to go neutralize them, or Viktor Orban saying that anyone who works for civil society is a bug, or what we saw in the first Trump administration where whole groups were vilified. And so the idea was that a story about an actual human being who was part of a vilified group, meaning the detainees brought to Guantanamo after 9/11 who were called the worst of the worst and all sorts of other things. We thought that story could be useful, at least by analogy. We didn't know at the time that we were going to see a second Trump administration and that we were going to see literally in 2025, the U.S. government sending more people to Guantanamo, more people from the, I'll say, primary vilified group in the U.S. these days, that is immigrants. And the government is literally using the phrase worst of the worst again to describe the people it is sending to Guantanamo from the U.S. And so we didn't realize that the scenario of Guantanamo detention, which is the setting for the book, would be getting repeated, but here we are. And so I still hope that this story, which obviously covers national security and legal issues because it's all part of representing someone at Guantanamo, but really focuses on a human relationship between two people, is a little bit helpful in countering what we are continuing to see now, where entire groups are getting demonized and treated quite horribly in connection with that demonization.
Yeah, well, I think it's really, it's important that you share your experience in that of Jabber as well. And like you said, I mean, it's not just for lawyers, this book. Obviously, you go into the legal insights and the procedure and the process that the detainees faced. But it's obviously, as you said, that kind of journey and that story and friendship brings people along and shows the humanisation of the detainees, who, of course, many of whom were not even charged with any crimes whatsoever. I also read just some interviews that you did around your work as a lawyer for those in Guantanamo. And I mean, it's really hard to read the torture that they suffered, and it was ongoing, persistent. And I mean, in those days, obviously, we've heard reports and we'd read reports from great agencies like Human Rights First and others, but we didn't have, social media wouldn't have been as active, and we didn't have that kind of instant reporting that we see now with other crises and issues that are happening around the world. But I'm wondering how the personal accounts that you shared being so deeply distressing as well, are you still in contact with some of those clients apart from just Jabir and his family? And also, where are we at now with Guantanamo and the detainees and places like that as well, other detention centres that were so grossly inhumane?
I am in touch with other clients. I actually got a short video just a few days ago from a human rights activist in Bahrain and one of our former clients. They were just kind of goofing around together and saying hello. It's still a bit surreal to see people who we only knew for years, dressed in jumpsuits and shackled to an eye bolt in the floor, to see them out and about just living as normal people. It's wonderful. I'm in regular touch with Jabber. He actually was gracious enough to give my teenage daughter, who had a school project on Guantanamo an interview a few weeks ago, because I said to her, "Hey, you should go to the source.
Yes.
You can get some firsthand information."
Absolutely.
So it's been terrific and empowering, I'd say, to be in touch with people who we first encountered under such terrible circumstances and who essentially have been able to turn the page and are back to their families and their lives. In terms of the situation at Guantanamo, there were about 800 supposed enemy combatants brought there after 9/11. As you said, very few were ever charged. In fact, even when it came to just accusations that didn't amount to charges, but the government's attempt to explain why people were there, over half of the people weren't even accused of taking any action against the U.S. We are now down to about 15 of those law of war detainees,
right?
Some of whom have been cleared for release, but due to various issues have not been sent home, and some of whom are actually charged with serious crimes relating to 9/11 and other terrorist activity. But those people have not even been tried over 20 years later because the government invented a new court system to be used at Guantanamo. And inventing a new court system, well, that's going to be susceptible to lots of legitimate challenges and logistical issues. So trials that would have been completed years ago had they been in civilian courts are still pending. And then since the spring of this year, we've seen about 800 migrants brought to Guantanamo, which would be scandalous for any reasonable mind person. But of course, the point with the Trump administration is to sort of revel in the fact that they're sending people to what maybe is the most notorious prison in the history of the world.
I think so.
Got to be top 5.
Absolutely. My God, it's truly harrowing, isn't it? And I know the families of those who were killed in 9/11, I remember listening to a podcast actually, and I think there was a group of family who'd gotten together and they were behind a lot of the cases and maybe trying to, I don't know whether they were funding them, but they were certainly supporting legal action. Is that still ongoing or?
So there are a couple of different things you might have heard about. There are groups of family members of victims of 9/11 who have been engaged to different degrees with these stalled prosecutions at Guantanamo. Some people have, in fact, tried to push the government away from bringing capital charges. Others have absolutely pushed for the death penalty. And then separately, there has been private litigation in civilian courts mostly aimed at Saudi Arabia that family members of victims have brought, and most of which is still pending as well.
Right, okay. My goodness. It's been going on for so long and through all the administrations as well. It's not just Trump, obviously. But I'm wondering just about your kind of opinion, given your expertise and your experience on international law, including your time with the United Nations in Kosovo, as you mentioned. And of course, your ongoing work that addresses ongoing challenges, holding players accountable for war crimes, violations of human rights in the US. How is, I suppose it's a very general and broad question, but international law, and given the week we're in as well with the United Nations, how is it functioning? Is it fit for purpose, given what we're witnessing on the international stage and given the frustration around international law?
For those of us who believe that ultimately we need to work towards accountability for the bad actors who violate international law, it's probably always going to feel somewhat unsatisfactory because it's such a complicated and difficult undertaking. And often one way or another, the rich and the powerful can end up on the other side of that. I don't see how one could argue that we're not in a very difficult moment when it comes to that. Simply the fact that the U.S. government has applied sanctions against judges and prosecutors at the International Criminal Court, the very same kinds of sanctions we applied in the past against bin Laden or the heads of narco trafficking organizations, that's a low point in the international justice story, and one that a number of us are trying to fight back against. So when you have the most powerful country in the world, not only beyond expressing indifference to violations of international law, but actually trying to destroy the people who are pursuing justice through those mechanisms, you're at a real low point. And if I could just to give you an example, I mentioned litigation relating to the sanctions that we were doing. Our client was a U.S. Army veteran. He'd been a military lawyer, and more recently was working at the ICC, the International Criminal Court, as a prosecutor on issues relating to Darfur. Even though the U.S. has almost always supported that particular work, the nature of the sanctions are so broad and so punitive that he was looking at the possibility of jail time or massive fines just for doing his work on Darfur. And so we had to sue the government in order to get him permission to go back and do that. So I can understand people being very discouraged in this moment, but I think it's always pushing uphill.
Yeah.
To fight for accountability. And even if the hill's a little steeper these days, I think we just have to, keep pushing however we can.
Yeah, and of course, your own personal experience witnessing such injustice in the likes of Guantanamo, for example, it must be hard to have that hope, or, how do you get through your work witnessing? I suppose Guantanamo in itself is basically lawless as such, where you're using legal instruments, legal mechanisms, and you know how to work against a system where there essentially is no law. And then, of course, looking at the international field in the context, people's frustration is that, well, it's there, but we're just not using it in the way that it should be used. And potentially that's down to whatever's going on in the political spectrum in the background. So how do you keep that hope and that kind of inspiration to keep going in the face of such injustice and these challenges that we have to push through?
As a purely personal matter, I suppose I try to continually refocus from the biggest picture to whatever small task I might tangibly look to accomplish at any given moment. I think if you consider the world as a whole and questions of justice in that broad context, that's really daunting. If you're thinking about what you can do for one particular client at one particular moment, it's at least more manageable. And certainly, as I talk about in the book, we concluded that even though the U.S. Supreme Court had said detainees can bring cases, that we were never going to get a judge in those post 9/11 years to actually order the government to release our clients. There was just too much fear. And so we developed a strategy that focused more on disclosing to the public what we could about our clients' stories, and then going to their home countries and saying, look, we know that the U.S. will release people to close allies when those allies put pressure on the U.S. to do it. That's what, all of the Western European countries had done almost before we got to Guantanamo. And so we campaigned to get our clients' home countries to do the same. And over the course of about 3 years in small batches, that's what happened. And that's how everyone got home. It was an example of a bunch of lawyers who were used to litigating, seeing that the normal toolkit wasn't enough. And while pressing forward on the litigation to whatever extent we could, putting some entirely new tools into our kit.
Yeah, and humanizing the situation. I think there's that kind of secrecy that was around Guantanamo. It was, that these people aren't human. It doesn't really matter what's going on. Turn a blind eye. That was kind of, the general attitude towards it. But I think, through the gates of hell, of course, you're going to explore that humanistic side of it. And I did read the evidence that was submitted as well. Again, as I mentioned earlier, truly, truly harrowing stuff. You wouldn't imagine it in a million years. But yeah, I guess that's what you had to resort to. In terms of activism, this is a question we ask nearly all of our guests, but I'm interested in your perspective, given, the organisation that you work with and your background. Activism and the law, your perspective on the relationship between the two and how maybe you're seeing the two drive real change, because you're obviously going to have to lean into different strategies. but maybe always with a particular community at mind. And I'm wondering, do you think in America, from your perspective, are grassroots movements becoming more engaged with the legal system? I think we're seeing that a little bit more here.
So we certainly tried to engage with, any constituencies we had who were sympathetic to the idea that, if you're going to hold somebody for the rest of his life, he deserves due process beforehand. And, that included traditional activists and sometimes political figures, people in the media. I think when you are facing a drastic situation that you're looking to remedy, you really need to rely on as many strategic paths as you can to try to fix things. And so wherever a lawyer can benefit from public advocacy that, others are doing, or expressions of discontent, that's really important. I mean, most of us who, to put it in what is almost a trite way now, believe in the rule of law in the U.S., are feeling so besieged these days. I think we have to keep in mind that we can't even be sure what will be the most effective tactics to oppose the administration's policies. And so we need to use all of them, even in relation to the same person who's being victimized or the same situation. Whatever you can reasonably try, you should. And hopefully we'll look back later and be able to, assess exactly what worked and, what got us to a better place.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've certainly been able to do that and share your fascinating career through your book, which I would encourage anybody to read. And just to mention again, we'll be featuring it on the Activist Lawyer Book Club next year, which is really exciting. But just for anybody listening who is interested in your career and specifically working in international law, in human rights and international law, what advice would you have for them, particularly as your roles as activist, advocate, author, lawyer? What can you share?
When law students or junior lawyers ask that question, my first response is always do whatever you can to get a foot in the door. That may involve volunteering. If you have a summer between school years where there's an opportunity to join an organization that you admire and do some work for free, try to make that happen. It's getting those bits of early experience that I think sometimes are the most challenging for people, no matter how pure their passion and dedication is. So, in my experience, it was offering my time for nothing, and in a few different contexts that got me that early experience working on those issues. So, wherever that's possible, I think it's a great strategy. And, then just remember, there are many more jobs at, big accounting firms and big law firms. This is a numerically more challenging field to get into. So you're going to almost certainly have to be a little scrappier than you would if you wanted to do mergers and acquisitions at some magic circle law firm. But I would argue that ultimately the benefits to you personally of getting involved in this kind of work are well worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, great advice. Well, Through the Gates of Hell, American Injustice at Guantanamo Bay is out now. And Joshua, I would just like to thank you for giving up your time to talk to us about your journey, about the book that we look forward to reading, and how could people keep in touch with you around your work or follow your work?
So I guess like everybody these days, I've got Instagram and LinkedIn. The website for Humanitas Media is a place to go and see where book events are and related information. And of course, the Human Rights First website and social media accounts are another spot to check out what we're doing.
Brilliant. Well, we look forward to that, and we'll be in touch with you around the book as well, and we'll be sharing links to that in our show notes. So thank you so much, Joshua, for joining me.
Thank you for being interested in this story. I really appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for joining me today. If you like the show, please remember to share and leave a review if you have a moment. And you can also check out our website, www.activistlawyer.com, where you will see some blog articles written by our guests and contributors, as well as some fabulous Activist Lawyer merchandise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team, using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.